So about last year, many of you started asking us questions about how to recognize plants such as eelgrass or algae such as rockweed along the coast of Casco Bay. So we've put together about a 20-minute tour of the coast of Casco Bay that will help you recognize these plants and algae and why we track them and how you can help us monitor the health of Casco Bay by tracking these plants and algae. We're going to start our tour in the salt marsh by looking at seagrasses. This is a photo taken at Broad Cove in Cumberland. The upper part of the salt marsh, the part that's closest to land-based systems, is characterized by a species of Spartina that is commonly known as salt meadow hay. And you can see, if you look in the foreground, why it's called salt meadow hay. It takes on the appearance of hay fields. And if you're a canoeer or a birder or you're driving down the road, this is how you might most often see salt meadow hay or Spartina patens. Leaving that upper marsh and transitioning to the lower marsh, the part that's closest to the water, we have a different species of Spartina, Spartina alterniflora, also commonly known as salt marsh grass. And this plant species is a little more salt tolerant. It's not so important whether you recognize the difference between the two species. What's important is that these are it's a very rich ecosystem that's incredibly important for the health of Casco Bay. So together, the salt marsh is a rich nursery grounds for many, many species of animals. And in its healthy state, you can see, unfortunately, due to erosion, how thick the marsh develops, and this spongy ability of the soil absorbs a lot of storm surge and can help with the impacts of sea level rise. And finally, a really healthy marsh helps us with mitigating our carbon footprint. So there's two ways we can reduce our carbon footprint. One is by actually reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that we burn, and the other is by figuring out ways to capture carbon dioxide. And healthy marshes are a wonderful way to do that, and that's called blue carbon. So remember that term for a little later in the presentation. Now you can see that to keep marshes healthy, there's a few things we as people need to do. We can help by saying, what can we do to help marshes recover from erosion? And then also we can preserve spaces behind the marsh, so as sea levels rise, marshes have places to migrate to. And this particular marsh is in McCoy Bay in Brunswick near Wharton Point. So what the town of Brunswick is doing in collaboration with the Maine Coastal Program and other partners is taking oyster shell and placing it along that eroded edge that you saw as a way to prevent further erosion and hopefully to capture sediment and allow this marsh to build back up. This is a new technique being piloted, so you can visit it and we can all track together whether this is successful. The next grass we're going to look at is eelgrass, and this is not found in the salt marsh. It's found in shallow, clear, salty waters, and you'll probably only see this in this way at extreme low tides. So these grassy blades here are the eelgrass, and if you are a boater, any type of boat, kayak, canoe, motorboat, sailboat, you may see eelgrass beds. This is what they look like in the near shore environment from above. Eelgrass beds are very fragile, so they're very susceptible to damage from boat props or paddling through it or people casting fishing nets. So that's a message you can help us spread to protect the health of these eelgrass beds. And we care greatly about them. They're another source of blue carbon. They also have been identified by the federal government as essential fish habitat and a habitat of particular concern. And the particular concern really is that they're very sensitive to environmental change. And in Casco Bay, the change that they're sensitive to is excess nitrogen loading. So we use the health of eelgrass beds to help us identify areas that have too much land-based nitrogen entering the system. And we use that information to then press for limitations on those land-based sources, whether it's through a Clean Water Act permit, a fertilizer ordinance, or some other means. So if we zoom in on this eelgrass, the photo here on the left shows eelgrass that has a lot of growth on it. And this tends to happen when you have too much nitrogen in a system. And this often is more evident at the end of the summer in August or September. And the photo on the right shows an eelgrass bed that is not very dense. And again, this can be an indication of too much nitrogen in the system. So if you're boating, these may be things that you may notice and be able to help us capture. Along the shore, again, we're traveling back to McCoy Bay now. When I was out there last week, I saw this rack of eelgrass in the marsh and went up to it and looked through, and indeed it was mostly eelgrass. And this kind of bothered me because healthy eelgrass shouldn't be breaking off like that this time of year and piling up on the shore. So I began digging through it to try to figure out why it had broken off and to see if there was something we could do something about. And in that pile, there were lots of eelgrass plants that looked like this. They were just pulled out by the root. And there was also eelgrass that was shredded. So think about it in your head and think if you have any guesses as to what could cause eelgrass to be destroyed like this. The answer is the invasive green crab. They rip out eelgrass beds when they are foraging for food. So although nitrogen is a really bad problem for eelgrass, that is often something we can try to do something about. We can press for limits. We can work with people to reduce nitrogen sources. When eelgrass beds are destroyed by green crabs, it's much more difficult because they're an invasive species and it's very hard to control their populations. We're going to leave behind plants and take a peek at algae along Casco Bay. Algae differs from plants. It doesn't have vascular systems. It doesn't have roots. And this is a photo from Broad Cove. And what we're looking at is the ubiquitous rockweed that grows along Maine's rocky coasts. So unlike eelgrass, people have asked in the past, how do I tell the difference between eelgrass and rockweed? Now that you see the photos, you can see the difference. But also eelgrass is found on that really smooth substrate. And rockweed is found on, it attached by holdfast to rocks along the coast. Now rockweed is also blue carbon source, and it is also designated as essential fish habitat. But separate from that, it has incredible value as a commercially harvested species. So in Maine, it is managed as a commercial fishery. And that's why you see rockweed in the news, because there's a lot of tension between its value as habitat and a blue carbon source and its value as a commercial fishery. Just to give you an idea of some things you may see with respect to rockweed, rockweed, when it is undisturbed, grows very straight and tall up to a height of 8 feet. Rockweed, when after it's harvested, or if maybe it's sheared off by ice in the winter, will have a more branching appearance like this. And there's some question raised about whether there's differences in its habitat value in those two states. And this is just to show you an example of rockweed's value as habitat. It supports juvenile cod, pollock, lobster, and many other commercially valuable species in Maine. So this algae, this type of algae, is something that you all have been amazing at helping us track and that we're going to continue to need a lot of help with this year. Many of you have asked us actually what this is. And I'm going to just flip to another slide so you can see the difference between these two blooms. It's not so important what it is, but that it exists in such thick mats. So most of the species in these blooms are ulva species of algae, but what we really care about is algae in a balanced Casco Bay is going to be present in just the right amount. When we have too much nitrogen loading from land-based sources, the algae is going to be available in these thick mats, like you see in these two photos. And when those mats set up and become very thick, as you can see, this is an intern from a few summers ago, and he's holding up some of the mat. They get heavy enough that they don't rise and fall with the tide. So for those of you who are helping us track these nuisance algal blooms, if you're there at different times, like not maybe just dead low tide, but as the tide is coming in, maybe you can help us see if you see the mat rising and falling. When it doesn't rise and fall, and this is an example of this from Mill Cove in South Portland, it uses up the oxygen underneath the mat and it makes the sediment very acidic. These are hostile conditions for marine life. So these juvenile clams are very, very stressed out and they will ultimately die from these conditions. The other thing that happens, and this is a bloom up in Basin Cove and Harpswell, is when these blooms set up early in May and June, like a lot of them are this year, when organisms go from their larval stages to wanting to settle in the mudflats to grow, like these teeny tiny clam spat you see here, these little baby clams, they get caught in the algae and they can't settle into the flat and finish growing and they die. So that has very negative and direct consequences for the health of Casco Bay. In addition to all of that, as these blooms die back, they release carbon dioxide and they contribute to coastal acidification. So if we know or we suspect that when we see these large mats, they're caused by an excess loading of nitrogen, you may be able to help us with some observations. And this is a bloom that was reported to us last summer in Broad Cove in Cumberland by a water reporter. And you can see on this side of the bloom, there's no green, there's a distinct edge. And you can see on this side of the bloom, there's a path. So when I came out here the first time, shortly after this was reported, I followed this pathway up and it led to 2 discharge pipes, which led me to question, could one of these be a source of nitrogen that was fertilizing the bloom? They both had flow coming from them. So Mike came back out in the field with me, and we also had a consultant with us from the town of Cumberland, and the consultant from Cumberland took bacteria samples from these 2 sources. Mike took nitrogen samples from these 2 sources, and he also took a nitrogen sample from Broad Cove. When we got the results back, we learned there was no bacteria in either source. So that meant we were pretty sure we could eliminate a failed septic system or a sewage leak as the cause of this bloom. The nitrogen levels here were very low. The nitrogen level here was very high and was higher than what was present in Broad Cove, which led us to assume that this was the most likely cause of the algal bloom, and we reported this to the town of Cumberland. The final kind of algae that you'll notice along the coast, or in sort of this common introduction to an overview, is phytoplankton. Now these are single cell algae without a vascular system, so you're not going to see a single phytoplankton out there. But sometimes you all report to us that the water looks murky or it's discolored, and that can be a phytoplankton bloom. Or right now you're actually reporting that the water looks really clear, and Mike's water quality monitoring is showing that chlorophyll levels are low and there isn't a lot of phytoplankton in Casco Bay. So this discoloration is from 2017 and it's a Corynea bloom. And a Corynea bloom is not good for the health of Casco Bay. So like the macroalgae that we looked at, when present in its natural state and in the right amounts, phytoplankton is super important to the health of Casco Bay. It's the base of the food web. Sometimes and increasingly and in different types of species, we have harmful algal blooms in Casco Bay that shut down our shell fisheries. And this Corynea bloom is a new species that first appeared in 2017. This is how brown it is. These are bottles of water from the Fore River where the Corynea had bloomed. And what's harmful about the Corynea is as it dies, it settles down to the bottom. And this is 14 acres of flats off of Bunganuck Landing in Brunswick. And as the bloom died on these flats, it used up the oxygen and killed the quahogs. This was in 2017, and as of the end of last summer, these flats still had not rebounded. So before I turn this over to you, Sarah, I just wanted to acknowledge how valuable everything you've done with your observations has been to us to date. On the left is a post by Tom Long, and Tom helped us last summer with tracking an algal bloom at East End Beach. And we were so interested in that bloom and his ongoing documentation of it, because off of East End Beach is the discharge pipe from the largest sewage treatment plant in Casco Bay. And we had worked very hard with the Portland Water District to come up with permit terms that meaningfully reduced, and by a large amount, like 70%, the nitrogen that was coming out into Casco Bay from that discharge pipe. And so the bloom, the nuisance algal bloom we had seen in Back Cove disappeared, and then suddenly there was this bloom at East End Beach. And through Tom's documentation, it drew not only Mike and I out, but the state marine biologist. And we were able to trace this back to seeps of land-based water from all the storms we had last spring. On the right is a photo by Rick Franz out on Great Diamond Island this spring of healthy young eelgrass beds. So we're excited to see this healthy growth, and we'll ask Rick to track its health later in the summer and to especially help us look for evidence of green crab predation, given how warm the winter was. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Ivy. So Ivy has shared all of this great information with us, and now you're probably wondering, okay, as a water reporter, what do we do with that information? And what we do is we can track these growths over time and how they're changing over time, because that's our primary use of water reporter right now, is to hear from all of you the changes you're seeing in the bay over time, both from how things have been and how they look as we move forward. And so I want to share, I want to go through some things together. But before we do that, just a quick note that we're not going to go over the details of like how to post step by step. I am always happy at any time to help you with that technology part, you know, either getting the app installed if you're new, or doing your first post if you're new, or Water Reporter changed the app. So maybe you need some help adjusting to the way it looks now. So I'm happy to do that at any time. I'll show you in a moment where you can find my contact information. And I think we're also going to throw that in the chat so that you have it handy. So what I want to do is share my screen with you, and we're going to look at a page on our website together. It's the Water Reporter page on our website. So give me just a second here to get set up. Here we go. So can someone shake their head and confirm that you can see the website? All right, awesome. And what I want to go over is a couple of things. So to start out, for anyone who doesn't remember or know, at any time you can go to our website, cascobay.org, and then go to How to Help, and then Be a Water Reporter. And that's how you get to the Water Reporter page on our website. And I'm going to scroll down just a little bit here. And the first thing I want to bring your attention to is off in this column on the side here is my contact information. So anytime you're looking to reach out to me, you have a question about Water Reporter, you can do so there. And then you're all doing an amazing job posting on a lot of different things that we want to see around the bay. And here's that reminder of some of the different kinds of posts that we want to see. But it doesn't mean that these are the only things that we need to see. So for instance, Ivy was talking about salt marsh at the beginning of her presentation. And so you could, if you're seeing something in a salt marsh that you want to track over time, you could add a hashtag salt marsh. You don't need to stick to just these hashtags. So I wanted to mention that. And then what I want to do is focus on those two kinds of posts that that Ivy's been talking about today in detail, and that's algae and eelgrass. So specifically for eelgrass, actually, for anyone who's interested, now is a good time to go and look for eelgrass along our coastal waters during low tides, because we're in another time period where we have astronomically high and low tides. And that's now through, I'm checking my notes, June 8th. So if you go and look and see when there are low tides and you go along the coast, you can look for eelgrass. And we want to see that and track that. Like Ivy said, it's such important habitat. We want to track that over time. And then the next thing that I want to bring your attention to is algal bloom tracking, specifically nuisance algal bloom tracking. And I am going to use a little link that we have over here to actually jump down in the page. And so this is the section on our website. We have this header up at the top to go through detail of how you can track the algal blooms, the nuisance algal blooms around the bay. So this first section goes over some of what Ivy's talked about today and gives you some visual examples. And then if I scroll down, there are detailed steps. So in addition to the steps that you do for any post, for these nuisance algal bloom posts, there's a few extra things that we're asking for to make them as useful for us as possible. And so you can read through all of these steps at some point. But what I would like to do is for all of us to look at the screen together now and see this section, because this is about how we're asking for you to describe your post and to add that comment as you're describing the image of your nuisance algal bloom. And this is a little different than last year, and that's why I'm highlighting it, both because there's new people who haven't done this yet, and there are folks that did it last year that we're looking for a little bit different information. And so most importantly is that first piece, that we want to know if there's a presence or absence. And we're asking for images of the absence of the growth, because when possible, we want to know when it starts and when it ends in a season. And many of you saw, we actually saw it in, it was March. We saw nuisance algal blooms in March, and when we weren't expecting to. And so we did a call for you all to go and take images then. So we want to know if it's there or not, most importantly. Second, you can add the name of your site, because as we're all scrolling through the post quickly, and I don't mean we as staff, like we as users, as you all are maybe going through Water Reporter and seeing what other people are posting, it's nice to see the name of the location there. The locations captured for our use to maybe, the GPS locations tracked. But it's nice for everyone to see. Then we want to know if it's increased or decreased since your last visit, if it is present. And then if you're familiar with intertidal zones like Ivy was referring to today, or this is a link to a NOAA page explaining intertidal zones, you can indicate which part of the intertidal zone, low, mid, or high, it's in. And as always with Water Reporter, if you're not posting in real time, we want you to add the date and time that you took the photo. And then hashtag. The hashtags are really helpful to us as we categorize posts and group them together. We can map them together when you use the hashtags. And so that's very helpful to us, because we might share that with our friends at the Department of Environmental Protection as well. So I put some examples here so you can see, like, the hashtag can either go in your text, replacing the word algae somewhere, or it can go at the end. So there's two examples there for you. And there's one more thing I want to bring your attention to on this page. Whoa, I knew that was going to happen. Is this map, but it's a little hard to see. What I did was map the locations where, some of the locations where we've already been tracking in Water Reporter, and specifically for nuisance algal blooms. And what I did is, if there's a location that already has a volunteer assigned to it, I put that, once you click, I clicked on the little icon you can see that Althea is offered to cover this site. So you can see where there are locations that are already being tracked, and then we can add to this map over time. And if you would like to participate in this effort, but you don't already have a site that you've indicated you would like to do, you can reach out to me, or maybe at the end of this call, at the very end of this call after Q&A, we can talk about that. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to mention. Yeah, I think that was it for now. You guys are just doing a great job, and we just want to make it easier for you to give us the information that helps us help the Bay. So let me stop that. And okay, so we're ready to take on any questions that you have, or hear your questions. I don't think there was too many in the chat as we went along. So if you have a question that you don't want to ask in real time, you can put it in the chat. Otherwise, what I'm going to ask is that you, so a lot of you are on camera, which is great. So if you're on camera and you have a question, you can literally physically raise your hand and we'll be able to see that. Or for those who aren't on camera but would like to ask a question in real time, you should be able to go to if you know how to raise your hand in Zoom, you can do it that way, which is going to the participants tab to do that. And then otherwise, you can put your question in the chat. So does anybody have questions? I threw a lot of information at you. Great. Sandy, I see you have a question. You can unmute yourself. There you go.
I may have missed something. Good presentation, by the way. And I may have missed something, but I was wondering why the green crabs rip out the eelgrass. Are they trying to eat the roots or something, or what?
They're foraging for food, and they're getting the green crab, they're getting the eelgrass out of the way. Mike, Excellent. Is there anything technical you want to add to that? But
no, that's it. They're just on their way to.
They're like, yeah, you're in my way.
Yeah. Thank you.
I know Susan Gilpin.
Yeah, go for it, Susan. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay. So I live on Skiddery Gusset Creek, and I can see the salt marsh. And I saw a really interesting picture of like lobster traps that were full of oyster shells, and they were keeping the salt marsh from eroding. But we all know that there's sea level rise. So isn't it a lost cause to prevent a salt marsh from eroding, and maybe we should put our energy somewhere else?
Well, that's an excellent question, Susan. And there's two efforts that are being done, and we're working in part on this through the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Governor's, the Maine Climate Council. So the first thing is that for priority marshes, looking at places where marshes can migrate inland. So as sea level rises, the marsh can continue to migrate back and perform its functions. And second, in that particular location, if you saw on the slide, there was a big difference between the upper marsh here and the lower marsh down here. And so they're trying to use those cages of oyster shells to help build the marsh back up to the level that it was at, so that it would prevent further erosion and then help catch sediment and build it back up. And Susan, honestly, it's a pilot project. That's why it's not being done everywhere. Part of the solutions to climate change are things that we need to test and try out. And that's why this is occurring on a small scale, and it's going to be fun and interesting to track.
So how do I know if the salt marsh that I can see from my window needs to be protected like that?
That's a good question. I think I'd have to look at it and see, and maybe we can arrange to do that in the field sometime. Mike, is there, I mean, I think I would ask Susan while you're out there to document, are you seeing the erosion, especially when there's extreme tides? But I think what right now there are efforts underway to identify marshes in places where they can migrate and to identify places where we can do the work. But on the tip of my tongue, do I have all the marshland like
No.
memorized and identified? I don't, but I'd love to see what you're talking about.
Okay, that'd be fun. Thanks.
So I think that Dan, you had a question. Is that true? There you are. Yes. Can you unmute yourself, Dan? Which I think, yeah, you'll tap your screen. There you go. Perfect.
That'll do it.
Yes.
Yeah, Ivy mentioned it might be helpful to have some photos that were not at dead low tide, which is when I've been taking all of them. And I presume that's only if algae is actually there. But if algae is there, is there any sort of guideline as to other times that might be helpful? An hour before or after or whatever?
What Mike and I noticed, and I would like him to answer this question as well, but when we first began sort of really tracking these nuisance algal blooms, 2016, 2017, sometimes because we were going to more than one site, we couldn't get to every site at dead low tide. And so if we got there and the tide was coming back in, we started noticing that some of the mats were floating up and we weren't seeing lowered pH underneath of them. So that's when we started really noting this difference. So from the observations that I've seen in the field, it's when the tide's going up or down, or staying down. And Mike, what else would you add to that in terms of what the water reporters should look at?
That's really it. Low tide's preferred, of course, when you're tracking these things from when they're not there to when they're there. But once you have an established mat, it is interesting to go back and see what it's doing at a higher tide, any tide. Is it floating with the water, moving around, or is it staying down at the bottom? So that's exactly it, really.
Okay, and I think also if you can get down to your bloom, like if yours, if you're out but on that causeway between Cousins and Little John, Dan, and the bloom is near the edge, and it's safe for you to get down there and you have a pair of gloves, you could even look and see if the mud underneath is black or you see clam spat caught in the bloom. It's those kind of things that help us track what impacts it's having on the health of Casco Bay.
And just two quick
Then
things.
I'll bring some shoes other than my bicycle shoes.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of my favorite bike routes too.
Two things to add to that. We were talking the other day, and maybe one of you mentioned it and I missed it, but looking, if you had a day and you were curious and looking at like 2-hour intervals, that's, you wouldn't want to, going back hourly wouldn't be helpful, but like a 2-hour interval or 4-hour interval to check on it. If you had a day that sounded like a great way to spend your time. And then safety is number one. So please ensure that, everyone is staying safe when taking these images. And we did have an image where someone was handling the algal bloom directly with their hand. We wouldn't encourage that. Please use, if you are going to do that, which is going above and beyond, please use a glove. Okay, somebody else had a question, I think. Erno, did you have a question? Oh, you're on mute, Erno. There we go. Oh, one more time. There you go, Erno.
I put something in chat about historically in the longer term, with sea level rise in the last few thousand years, some of these peat beds have been buried by beach sediments, especially at wells. At low tides in wells, you can see tree trunks in the surf, and that's the ultimate blue carbon sequestration, is having them totally buried. So there is value if you can avoid the erosion, which releases the carbon, and be lucky enough to have sediment cover it and it be more permanently sequestered.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ivy.
I don't really know. I know that I know exactly the site you're talking about, Erno, down below the Wales Estuarine Reserve at the end of the Drake's Island Beach, but I don't know how well that sequesters carbon. I do know when there's decomposition that it releases carbon dioxide. So I'm not sure if that is part of the solution, but it's a very interesting question and one that I look forward to asking the other members of the Coastal Marine Working Group. Mike, are you familiar with the?
Not really, no, down there.
I mean, my goal is hopefully to preserve the salt marshes, not to have to bury them. And how we figure out how we do that, how we can work with the marshes with nature-based solutions to make them resilient in the future.
Oh, Erno, you're back on mute, so we can't hear what you're sharing. Oh, there you go.
The marshes will, the lower end of the marsh will no longer be viable as marsh.
That's
It
part of
becomes
why we're looking at,
subtidal.
yeah, that's part of why we're looking at the migration and trying to identify places where marshes can migrate inland. So it looks like John Moore has his hand up.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm actually down in Washington, D.C. at the moment, but about to come back up to Maine. And I found sometimes when I was taking the pictures, you know, at high water tide, whatever, that the what I caught it with the camera didn't really add, or at least my description of how green it was difficult. Is there any location on your training that helps with that, how to identify the different levels? And I tried to do a comparison. It didn't seem to always work.
Can
I'm
you
not
restate
sure
the
I
question?
understand the question
Yeah.
100%, John. Can you try to rephrase it for us?
Okay, that when I was doing the pictures of the water quality and then tried to compare it to the you know, your model, you know, you do a comparison against the colors that you provide, there was difficulties linking them up.
I see. I think you're referring, John, to a project that we've since ended, and Water
Okay.
Reporter is a different effort.
Okay. Gotcha.
So now there's no matching between things. We're
Okay.
looking for observational photos.
Okay.
But I'm glad you asked the question because we did launch these two things at the same time, and we've only moved forward with Water Reporter. And so we want to focus everybody's efforts there as much as possible. If someone still has that app and still wants to use it, it's great for the international groups using that information. But for us and our work, Water Reporter, these observational images are really important. So,
Okay.
and specifically on some of the topics that we've identified here.
Yeah.
Thanks for the.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, in using that Water Reporter more than the color app that we had also piloted a few years ago, just noting discoloration, it doesn't matter what color it is, but if you see like a brown bloom like that or discolored water, that's of interest to us. And we'll often try to take the boat out and take a look at it. And if it looks like Karenia or something suspect and not healthy for the bay, we report it to the Department of Marine Resources, and they're very trained, and they come out and they take the samples and they can analyze it. So more than a concern about that color, just discoloration will be very, very helpful.
Thank you.
So let's see, we have another moment or two here. Who else has something to add or question?
If we don't have any questions, Kathy, do you have anything you want to add to the discussion as we wrap up?
I do. Thank you, Ivy. I want to thank all of you and the people who didn't get to join us live today, those of you who watch this later on in the recording. The power of what you are doing with us, it's really a dual power. You know, we like to refer to Ivy being a water keeper as the eyes, ears, and voice for our favorite body of water. but her eyes and ears and voice can't be everywhere. And by having your eyes out there as an observing network, the power in that is phenomenal. That's the first power. The second power is that as you continue this work with us over time, you're building a series of documented conditions and observations out there. And for the situations where you're picking a particular site that you're going to monitor to either look at erosion, sea level rise, what's happening with rockweed, what's going on with the edge of the salt marsh, whatever those things might be, to the degree that you can continue, as Sarah has advised you over the last couple of years, continue to go to the same spot and get the same camera angle if you can, as long as it's safe. Whatever way you decide to set that up for yourselves, the power of before and after photos and the power of change over time documentation is palpable. It pictures 1,000 words, you know the story. So this is a very exciting, when we launched those two programs a couple of summers ago, this has been a very exciting development to have this particular tool be so well adopted by all of you. I think Sarah may have shared with you earlier, this year we crossed the 1,000 post threshold. The group of you is doing more active water reporting than any group in the United States. And Friends of Casco Bay is being lauded for that. In fact, Sarah did a presentation for a Chesapeake Bay group yesterday because they're trying to figure out how can they build their reporter network out and how is the recruitment done by different groups. So we really owe that to you and your dedication, not only to place, but to working with our organization, for being patient when there are things like upgrades to the app that aren't particularly well communicated by the developer, and Sarah's running interference on that with all of you. But it's incredibly powerful what you're doing. We want to encourage you as an observing network. I know that Sarah is diligent about acknowledging each post. Don't hesitate to respond to each other's posts as you look at them, just even with a wow, look at that, because that encourages all of you. It reminds you that you're all looking at each other's work. This is a network, and it connects all of us, and that matters. That matters a lot. So we thank you for your work.